Hello, everybody. Welcome to the morning show. We're coming to you today on WJOP LP Newburyport at FM 96.3 on Channel 9 and on Newburyport Community Media at ncmhub.org on our YouTube channel. I'm your host, Mary Jacobsen, and I am so honored, really, to welcome award-winning biographer Megan Marshall here. She's going to be discussing her first biography, The Peabody Sisters, Three Women Who Ignited American Romanticism, which was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. She's currently the Charles Wesley Emerson Professor at Emerson College, and she's past president of the Society of American Historians. Today, we're going to talk about the lives of Elizabeth, Mary, and Sophia Peabody, sometimes called the American Brontes, and how they shaped the thinking of their day. Megan is also the author of two subsequent biographies, Margaret Fuller, A New American Life, which won the Pulitzer Prize, and Elizabeth Bishop, A Miracle for Breakfast. Megan was herself a student of the late, great poet. I'm happy to report that Megan will be featured in an upcoming program right here in Newburyport that'll be held at 2 p.m. on November 5th at the First Religious Society Unitarian Universalist at 26 Pleasant Street, during which she'll discuss the Peabody Sisters and her other writing. That event is free and open to the public. Megan, welcome to the morning show, and thank you so much for taking time to visit us today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Mary, and thanks for that very generous introduction.
Well deserved, and that's the half of it. So, Megan, reading the Peabody Sisters, I came to understand you spent 20 years researching the sisters' lives, really immersing yourself in their era and their individual and family environment, their friendships, their romances, their mentorship. Now, that takes devotion and commitment. And I'm curious to find out, what kind of connection did you feel to the Peabody Sisters that drew you to study and narrate their life stories?
Well, I'm really glad you asked that question, and I'm also grateful for the opportunity to talk about this book again on Saturday afternoon, because it was my first book and my first love as a biographer. When I began work on this book, I had been working as a journalist, covering women's issues, contemporary issues of the day. And as I talked to women, this was the early 1980s, so quite a while ago, women pioneering in professions and, making up new ways of living, of new kinds of families and new ways to rear their children. I kept hearing them say, well, we're the first women to face these questions. And I have always had kind of a historical bent. I wasn't a history major in college. I was a literature major, but I always liked to kind of look back. And I thought, I would try to find a way to test this notion. I thought of trying to find several generations of women to write about, which in the end I did in this book. I wrote about sisters' mother and their children to some extent. But also I was very lucky to find three women who, it was kind of a test case. They had the same family, the same upbringing in a way, but made very different choices in their lives. And the 20 years that I spent working on them, a lot of that had to do with, these were not that well-known women. So their letters were all handwritten in archives all over the country, scattered mainly with the papers of their famous husbands. Sophia Peabody married Nathaniel Hawthorne, and Mary Peabody married Horace Mann, and Elizabeth, who didn't marry, her papers were even more scattered. So the 20 years was an engagement in large part in their writing and their voices. And very quickly, my interest shifted from, trying to apply our 20th and 21st century questions to 19th century women's lives. I just kind of fell in love with them. Their very expressiveness in their letters and journals, the specific problems that they faced, which do reverberate with our time. But and then working people often said, well, aren't you getting sick of them? Do you get impatient? But I found that because they were so different, I could always shift my loyalty among them. Although don't tell them, I don't want them to think I have favorites. But Sophia, the youngest, was an artist and kind of an invalid, and struggled to find a way to express herself in relation to these very powerful two older Sisters. And as I was struggling with my own project, I really learned a lot from her patience. And Elizabeth was a very dramatic and daring oldest sister, and that was inspiring. And Mary, I was a middle child myself, and my initials Megan Marshall go with Mary Mann. I was kept reading her MMs and thinking, wow, this is, anyway. So it was a matter of strong identification and of their kind of lifting me through my own life of marriage and motherhood. And I was learning from them all the time.
Well, you know, Megan, it's interesting to hear you talk about it that way, because the feeling I had at times as I was reading your book was that you were a time-traveling fourth sister.
Oh, that's a nice idea.
And anyway, they do come across, and I think part of the benefit of the time that you spent researching them, and really the immersive environment of the whole Peabody family, is that you really get a sense of each sister as a distinct character, not only their achievements, but their conflicts with one another. I mean, they're sisters. There's going to be conflicts with one another, their competitiveness and their mutual support, and the way that they completed one another, you know, and we're also loyal to one another. And so thus, you wrote, in my sense, my reading anyway, like a fourth sister. Anyway, I hope that's something that pleases you.
Definitely. Thank you. Thank you. Great compliment.
Well, you know, one of the things that I enjoyed and learned from about your book was you really show the distinctive character of the times that they were living in, and how they were both shaped by, and in turn shaped these times by virtue of their life stories, including, I must say, a surprising amount of equality between the sexes at the time, and also a huge amount of intellectual and also religious questioning. And your title telegraphs how history remembers this time, American Romanticism. But I was hoping that you could help us understand better what American Romanticism means in the context of this period. And then with that, how American Romanticism both shaped and was shaped by the Peabody Sisters.
Yes, well, that's a big question, and I'll do my best to answer that. First, I should say that American Romanticism is the term that we give to that period now. They would have, if they chose a term for their ideology, they probably would have said Transcendentalism, although that got a lot of guff from people, and sometimes they wanted to dodge that too. And of course, particularly these Peabody sisters, came to it out of Unitarianism. I can explain that in a minute, but why American Romanticism? There was, the seeds of this began with the German Romantics. You know, we think of Romantic music, there were Romantic philosophers as well, and that spread to England through the English Romantic poets. We think of the Romantic poets, Wordsworth and Coleridge, and all of them were kind of infected by this idea of the romantic self, of the romance of the self, and the self in nature. And now you're starting to hear what we think of, what we associate with Transcendentalism. So this group of people, and in many ways, the women were ahead of the men. This is part of what my book shows. Elizabeth Peabody and also Margaret Fuller, maybe partly because they were women, edged their way into this movement by way of translating often German writers, French writers. So Elizabeth Peabody's translation of a book by a French writer, de Girondeau, called Self-Education was absolutely formative to Emerson. You know, the idea that of the American scholar is not somebody who's sitting in the library and you know, answering the questions from their professor at Harvard. They're self-educating, and seeking their own light. So you mentioned you know, I had taken one women's history class at Harvard, the first one that was ever taught. You know, this was in the mid-70s, and that was a new field. And I learned the concept of separate spheres, which is probably familiar to people, the 19th century notion that women were in one place, men in another place, women in the home, men in the public world, and never the twain shall meet. But I was interested to find that that was really not the case for certainly this group of people in before the Civil War. the very rebellion that the men were experiencing against Harvard, against the staid curriculum, and was something that allowed women in. Because if the men were sort of devaluing the establishment, and the establishment college that women could not go to, that meant there was an opening for women to participate.
Yeah.
And I have to say, although in both my books, Ralph Waldo Emerson doesn't necessarily come off all that well, he was the one to reach out to the women, invite them to the Transcendental Club meetings, and with some, probably ambivalence, not always encouraging, did put Margaret Fuller in as the editor of the Dial and Elizabeth Peabody as the publisher of the Dial, and was happy to have Elizabeth Peabody. So this is a great, moment towards the end of the book. She opens a foreign language bookshop in Boston that becomes the meeting place of the Transcendentalists, where they can get these books that they're reading that bring the news of Romanticism from across the Atlantic. And it's a kind of subscription library. You don't have to buy the books. You can just check them out for a while. And Margaret Fuller's conversations were there. Elizabeth Peabody herself had a salon where all these people met. Some of the Transcendental Club meetings took place there. And so it was a real hub for this group in Boston. We often think of the Transcendentalists as kind of situated out in Concord or maybe at Brook Farm, but Elizabeth Peabody provided the home base in Boston.
Yeah, so they were, in other words, allowed in, and once they got in, they were real movers and shakers.
I forgot to answer the question about Unitarianism, which I meant to say was that, I was raised myself in a Unitarian church, we said at the time, not a fellowship. And I think I really benefited from the kind of open-spirited notion of, each person makes their own choice about their religious beliefs. And as I was taught, God is a sort of immanence in all of us, bringing us all together. And I really had no idea when I started in on the Peabody Sisters that they were so strong a part of Unitarian history, that the Unitarian Church developed. It didn't even have its name until 1815, at a time when Elizabeth Peabody was absolutely entranced by this new, more progressive religion, and started hanging out in the bookshops that sold the books that the Unitarians were reading, and became a very close friend as a young girl of Reverend William Ellery Channing, who was the Boston minister who took that term on. And it's fascinating how within just 10 years, the Transcendentalist young ministers of Unitarianism were turning against that and saying, this is old-fashioned for us. So, we think that intellectual fashions change very quickly now. Well, they did then.
Yeah.
Too.
Yeah, one of the things that I found very engaging about Elizabeth in particular in the time, was the element of doubt about religious concepts that had been handed down and were presented as, you accept this because we have the authority to tell you what God is. We have the authority to tell you what religion is supposed to be. And it was like, no, I don't think so. Just the kind of fervent of the questioning and the excitement that comes through at that time, and that the Peabody Sisters were a huge part of participating in and expanding it, and including their perspective, and their participation as women was also just unprecedented and a statement by itself. So it was really quite an extraordinary time.
Yes, and not always easy for them to do. And that's really what fascinated me as the biographer, was what are they going to do in a situation where they're not, Sophia Peabody was herself a very brilliant, I described her as an invalid and an artist, but when she was young, she was fascinated by these same issues and wished she could be a minister. She really couldn't. She couldn't be a minister. So that was a part of the frustration that I think that went into her complex of illness. But Elizabeth Peabody wasn't going to be stopped. She couldn't be a minister, but she'd hang out with them. She'd even feed them ideas. And she would be first, before, perhaps the listeners know that Ralph Waldo Emerson is kind of famous for giving up the ministry. And the issue he gave up the ministry over was the serving of communion. He didn't believe this, he thought it was sort of more smoke and mirrors of the sort that the, Puritans originally left England to get away from.
Yeah.
You can see that the descent of the line of resistance and a kind of purity, seeking a spiritual purity and honesty and authenticity. But before he did that, Elizabeth was saying, I'm not going to sign up for any of these churches that require communion or expect communion. She had found her way to that idea as well. And in fact, she also was, she would claim, and I think accurately, the first person to apply the term transcendentalism to this new thinking that they were using, that they were coming up with, the Romanticism that had made its way to the U.S., to this new world, the new country that it had. Yeah. She said, we'd had the first revolution in politics. This is a more interior revolution.
Yeah. And to do that, you have to have a pretty strongly developed sense of self, which each of the sisters certainly had. And that doesn't happen by itself. Usually it's cultivated in families. And that brings me to what I also wanted to talk to you about, which was the family, its role, because this book is also, I used to be a therapist, and I studied, family systems theory and therapy, and this book is like an historical case study of a family system at work. And it reminded me, as I was reading it, one of my favorite quotations from Carl Jung was his observation that nothing has a stronger influence on their children than the unlived life of their parents. And I love that phrase, the unlived life of their parents. I find it so evocative. So could you talk about the impact on the sisters of their mother, Eliza, who certainly had an unlived life, and how her unlived life impacted her daughters?
Yeah, thanks. That's a good question. I guess I should explain that more or less by chance, I guess you'd say. This was a family of 6 children, but the first 3 were these daughters that I'm writing about. Then there were 3 sons who really struggled in their own way, but it was the 3 daughters who were kind of most exposed to the parents, and their mother, Eliza Palmer Peabody, was from a prominent family during the Revolution. She was born around the time of the Revolution, and the family lost everything, as many who were committed to the cause did. Her father had been a general, but now they had nothing. And she had to really fend for herself. She was educated, very well educated, kind of self-educated, reading a lot when she was young, and Shakespeare and all of that. But she had to go out and work as kind of a maid of all work for a relative who had a school up in Atkinson, New Hampshire, Haverhill, near Haverhill. And this was a minister's household, and her boss was the sister of Abigail Adams. But Eliza Palmer had to just work herself to the bone, while she was also often teaching these students and writing their themes for them to give in oration. And she started writing poetry and publishing poetry in the Haverhill Gazette, which I was able to find. She published under a pseudonym. So then, she kind of saw that marriage was going to be her only way out of this, and she located Nathaniel Peabody, who was from a much more impoverished background, had made it to Dartmouth, and was studying to be a doctor. They met when they were both teaching in a kind of private school in Andover, and this was the best I think she felt she could do, and she had hopes for him. He was college educated, he was going to be a doctor, but he didn't have get-alongity is the term that they get-alongity.
Yeah.
So while he did practice, and he later became a dentist, or he tried being a farmer, the family was often really supported by Eliza running schools in the household, which set a great example for the daughters of women as I think it wasn't just their mother, but some of their mother's sisters were running schools nearby, and it set up a profession. And she wasn't just running any old school, she was quite innovative in her curriculum too, which led the way for Elizabeth to do the same. But I think in a way most crucial for these 3 sisters, who you said they had quite a strong sense of self. I don't think any of them ever felt that accomplishment or intellect was in any way in conflict with femininity, womanhood. Whereas there are other women of that period, Elizabeth Cady Stanton or Margaret Fuller, who were educated by very strong-willed fathers and told, you have a mind of a boy. And they were given a boys' curriculum, and they kind of, this led to a lifelong kind of split within the self, and also, of course, to some very interesting thinking about gender roles in the case of Margaret Fuller. But Elizabeth Peabody never doubted her strength and her intellectual strength, and she would sometimes consult people as to whether it was all right. She asked Reverend Channing if it's okay to open this bookstore, and he said, well, I think it would be appropriate for a woman to do this. He sometimes discouraged her from doing things, not wanting, she shouldn't be putting herself forward. But I think she just took that as part of the times and went ahead. But I want to say, aside from the parents, I think often the influence of siblings is really important too, as I'm sure you would say from your training. And so they really spurred each other on. And in some ways that counteracted a kind of a bit of a gloom and doom sense on the part of their mother. Continually, things were not working out.
Yeah, there were a lot of obstacles, certainly, that Eliza encountered, and the sisters, as so many sisters do, spurred one another on, but they also competed with one another. And I think in a family, any family, siblings tend to carve out niches for themselves, and and that's sometimes affected by birth order, but a lot of that has to do with what's happening in the family at the time and what the family needs. So it's like you get your job description in some ways from the emotional needs of your family. And then there's freedom to maneuver. But each of the sisters also kind of, as we all do, if we grew up with siblings, you're kind of pinging off one another where you can find the freedom to express yourself and a niche that hasn't been filled by a different sibling. And that's part of what was really interesting to me, the family dynamics about your book, as you have, so eloquently talked about. The other thing that I noted and enjoyed about your book was the sense that there was something of a salon that the Peabody sisters had, especially Elizabeth. And it made me think about the Bloomsbury Group. It made me think about Gertrude Stein in Paris. And because they had a very influential circle of friends that if they weren't famous at the time, they're certainly famous now. So I was hoping that you could talk a little bit about what their salon was like of, literary lights and thought leaders. And today, I guess we call some of them, God help us, influencers. But you've mentioned some of them. You mentioned Emerson and Channing. But tell us a little bit about how broad their net was cast for the people whose lives they impacted and who impacted them.
Well, I think there's a point at which I was lucky to find a lost journal of Elizabeth Peabody's, in which that sort of covers the period of the rise of the Transcendentalists, the rise of Nathaniel Hawthorne and Horace Mann. And she's visiting them all. She's bringing them together, bringing sometimes the families living in Salem, sometimes in Boston. These men are passing through, and she writes, why am I attracted to these three great powers as she saw them? This is before any of them were really all that well known. Maybe Horace Mann was the best known of the three. And she says, does the becoming interest the human heart more than the arrived? I thought that's
That's a great phrase.
So the becoming, and that kind of became a watchword for me. I was interested in the becoming of the Peabody sisters very, very much. But it's astonishing that she could maintain this powerful friendships with three men who really, I would say, disliked each other. I mean, they were very powerful, but Emerson was quite dubious about Hawthorne's, his fictions. Horace Mann was even more dubious about Hawthorne's fictions. When Hawthorne wrote a campaign biography for Franklin Pierce, who was not well liked by most of the kind of abolition-minded New England elite, intellectual elite. He said that was Hawthorne's greatest work of fiction, was his biography of Franklin Pierce, who did win the election. Anyway, so to me, that was really extraordinary. Sometimes it was a matter of shuffling things so that they weren't around at the same time. And you may know that Emerson had himself a kind of, he used his house as a gathering place and would have people come and stay for great periods of time. He was trying to get his the people he enjoyed intellectually sparring with or conversing with to move to Concord, and some of them did. So Elizabeth was one of those people who went and stayed there for a long time. And she thought, it's another thing she wrote in the journal, you know, I would like to do as Emerson did and gather about me, you know, these associates as my leaves and fruit, she said. And that's what she did with the bookstore, where she had the salon, and they were, you know, some of them the well-known people, some of them not so well-known today. And I think that's, you know, you're very right to compare this period to the Bloomsbury period and to the, you know, Gertrude Stein's household in Paris. Yeah. But it was maybe a sort of briefer moment. Yeah. And the romantic entanglements, in the case of the Peabody sisters, they led to marriage, and that was exciting. There are lots of other undercurrents that I cover a little bit more in the Margaret Fuller book, with Emerson and Fuller and three young, two women and a young man who were sort of trying to start a constellation, they called it.
Oh, I like that.
Yes.
That's a good way to put it.
We had a compact and a constellation, you know, and Emerson's married, of course, at this time, and raising kids. But anyway, I think that was another thing, conclusion that I came to, was that Emerson, also in Reverend Channing, these men who were ministers had a kind of license, I guess you could say, to be almost a confessor of these women. It was there, you know, it was possible for the ministers to have friendships with women and to minister to them, which really also opened the door to these intellectual connections. Yeah.
Well, you know, they were clearly trying on, envisioning new ways that you could be in the world and new freedoms that you could have with one another. Which is what makes us so fascinating for us to look at today. And it's often easy to forget that there were those progressive periods in the past where, in some ways, their imaginations may have been farther along. I mean, I love the idea of having a constellation, you know. But you know, but the Peabody sisters are not as well known as two of their husbands, Horace Mann and Nathaniel Hawthorne. And by the way, who knew Nathaniel Hawthorne was such a heartthrob?
Yes. Yeah.
After I was reading your book and about how, you know, how handsome he was, and I had to go look up to, really, you know, I need to find pictures of this man. And yes, if the oil paintings I found on the covers of some of this book are, yeah, he was a George Clooney of his day, for sure. But so Megan, you know, you referred earlier to the fact that they are not as well known, and thanks to you, they're better known now. But why weren't they as well known? Was it just the kind of raw sexism of their time asserting itself?
Well, I think, yeah, it's a complicated question, and I guess to me as a biographer, this was an entry point. I had some new ground to plow, and to try to bring them back into the light. I think they were known. I mean, it's the same thing's true of Margaret Fuller. She was one of the most famous women of the 19th century. Elizabeth Peabody was an eminent, in the end, she ended up founding the kindergarten in the United States, and people used to know that, you know. So why do they not know that anymore? We've moved on to other things, I guess. But I also trying to make the case with this book that it's the interior lives of people and the private lives of interesting people, women and men, that that I think are really gripping reading, and that I was kind of trying to turn this public world inside out.
Yeah.
And so you really get a different view of Nathaniel Hawthorne, of Emerson, of Horace Mann. Thoreau even kind of drifts through from this point of view of the women who were, you know, in a certain way they couldn't really shine, and yet they made their presences felt. And you know, that's often true for women now, even though we have many more professions we can work in. Where are we in those professions? So
Yeah.
what I felt I could do with this book was show ways that women had exerted their ambition in the past. I mean, for Mary and Sophia, it was not, you know, these days we would probably be ashamed to say so, but they were ambitious about their marriages. And they succeeded immensely. I mean, think of that. They were from, you know, kind of genteel poverty, and they end up marrying, you know, two of the most significant men of the 19th century.
Yeah.
And that's an accomplishment. And then what did they do with those marriages? They supported the men. They wrote things around them. They were, you know, Mary Mann later wrote Horace Mann's biography, and both of the marriages ended, you know, the men died fairly young. So the marriages were not really all that, didn't last that long. So anyway, I think, I guess I'm trying to sort of turn that question around and say, I think what we value in biography can really be quite varied. It need not be, you know, certifiable accomplishment.
Right. It doesn't have to be a person's resume. It could be, as you put it, the interior experience of their thoughts and their feelings. And that's a creative endeavor all by itself.
Yes, and we're lucky to have the documents of this because they married the famous men.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think the other value of going about it this way is, you know, people have said to me, they read the book, they said, now I finally understand what Transcendentalism is. And I think, you know, I'm not sure there's any place in the book where I say, this is what Transcendentalism is. I think what they're saying is that they experience through these women what it was like to be moving through life in those times.
Yes, absolutely.
And to absorb those ideas and believe in them, discuss them. So, you know, I think that was the merit to this, to focusing on the women.
And the positive reward for spending the 20 years you did on the project, really immersing yourself in the period and the thoughts and the emotions and the culture of the day. So extremely well done.
Thank you.
Well, you know, I was curious also. I know that you've written two other biographies. One of the, you know, feminist visionary Margaret Fuller, A New American Life, which won the Pulitzer Prize. Congrats on that forever. And another on the extraordinary poet Elizabeth Bishop, A Miracle for Breakfast, which is a wonderful title, and with whom you personally had the opportunity to study. So I was curious, do you feel a kinship or unifying connection shared by all your subjects, or a unifying connection to whatever it was that drew you to these three people?
Well, they are all New Englanders. I'm not a New Englander, but I was very drawn to the literature of New England, even as a child, the children's books, Little Women, that sort of thing.
Yes.
And I'm also very much drawn to youth, childhood, you know, how people define themselves. And all five of these women left just incredible documents of that sort. Margaret Fuller and Elizabeth Bishop certainly much more known, but I was astonished to find that both of them had very powerful recollections of periods in their childhood where, well, Elizabeth Bishop wrote a great poem called In the Waiting Room, that's about this moment of discovery in Worcester, Massachusetts in 1918, when she's turning 7. She says, I am an Elizabeth. what does that mean? What shall I do with it? And Margaret Fuller had almost the exact same experience. Just one day when she was young on the stairs, she said, I'm walking down the stairs. Why am I a what does it mean that I'm this Margaret Fuller? What am I to do? And this led, in Margaret Fuller's case, to the great questions of the conversations that she held for women in the 1840s in Boston. Was, what were we born to do, and how should we do it? So I guess I'm attracted to that period of questing and self-definition, and often through writing. I mean, these are really bookish people, and I was a bookish girl growing up, and that was the kind of kids book I like to read. And so it's, I'm writing about how ideas enter their minds. In the case of Elizabeth Bishop, how does she turn experience into the words, the wonderful words that she uses, and there was a lot to say about all of them. So
absolutely.
I should say, the Pulitzer is very, very important to me, but the Peabody Sisters won 2 history prizes. I had not thought of myself as a historian, but I had no idea that my publisher was entering my book in these for these awards. But the Francis Parkman Prize by the Society of American Historians for the best writing in American history of that year, that's a prize that, in some ways means more to me. It was my first book. I didn't think I was a historian, and that's why I'm a member of the Society of American Historians, and later became the president of it in recent years. So I think, and that was after, this 20 years of not being sure I would really be able to even finish this book. So, I had a lot to learn about research. I was not, I didn't have a PhD. That's another message I want to tell people. The people in the archives want you to come. If you're curious, go there.
Well, I mean, that's remarkable. I didn't realize that about. I mean, I was thinking of you as an historian because of your body of work. So that's kind of fascinating, and also pretty darn inspiring as well. And I think it's what I liked about what you were saying about what drew you to your different subjects was talking about the discovery of a self, or what it means to be a human being, what it means to be alive, what makes me as an individual different from other people, and how do we put that together. And certainly I was a bookish kid too, and reading can be such a vital resource to look for reflections of both what feels true about yourself that you gain from other people, and what you come across that doesn't feel true. And, I'm different from that. And so thank you for that description. That was excellent. I really appreciate that. You have talked, eloquently about biography and what drew you to your subjects. But I was also curious, Megan, about what is it about the art of biography in particular that's different from other kinds of historical writing? And you're clearly an historian now, whether you used to think of yourself that way or not. Your biography, your work as a biographer brought you there. And so, but it's a different kind of writing. And I'm not sure I would know how to put it into words, but what is it that you find really appealing or a good fit for you about the art of biography in contrast to other kinds of historical writing?
Well, my own interest in reading biography goes way back to when I was little. I loved the children's biographies, sometimes Amelia Earhart. And, I liked reading how, people overcame adversity and or self-doubt or whatever it might be. And as a writer of biography, I see that it's a genre in which you can really tell a story in a sort of old-fashioned traditional way. There's a beginning, a middle, and an end. And the biographer really, these days, myself, you sort of try to fight against the sort of march of chronology, but you're always working it. It's always there for you to support the endeavor, some kind of story. And you can imagine writing about 3 sisters that, there are 3 beginnings and 3 middles and 3 ends. So how did I weave them together? But my aim was, to write almost as if this were a novel, and the kind of novel that, you don't read anymore because we're writing modernist novels or minimalist novels or fragmented novels or, upside down novels. And the Peabody Sisters begins with a scene kind of actually at the end. I mean, it's paired with two scene at the beginning and the end are scenes that both really are chronologically at the end. And then you have this very long flashback to how did they get there.
Yeah.
So that's something you might do in fiction.
Yes, for sure.
And
Yeah.
I had also in that story, not thought I would write a story. See, I'm calling it a story. It's a book. It's real. That's the thing. It's kind of frustrating to me sometimes because I'm everything is true in these books, and sometimes there's a lot of documentation for it, but I'm not one to say, oh, I found this great manuscript, nobody's ever said this before. And so the discoveries are sometimes in a way buried. You might notice them through the endnotes, but anyway, it's all true. But I had not thought, with this in mind, not wanting to do the conventional biography. I thought, I am not going to have the ancestors. Who wants to spend time with the ancestors? But what do you know? I find that there's this incredible scandal, very formative in the lives of the Peabody sisters back in their mother's childhood. I won't spoil it by talking about it. And it was very distressing to discover this just anyway. It wasn't a story I really imagined would be part of this, but there it was, very important to tell. And so, yes, I have a chapter about ancestry, but I think that was all the more important that I begin with this opening scene later in life, so you see who they're going to become, and then we can go back and, lucky thing, I guess, you found their mother entrancing.
Well, I think it's a novelistic technique, flash forward, flash back, but it's all true. And it's a great way to engage the reader and get us interested in, I'm going to call them the characters. And then because you start wondering immediately, well, how did they get here? And so there's something to be said for hooking your reader as well, no matter what you're writing. So thanks for that explanation, Megan. One more question, and I know sometimes people don't like to share what they're currently working on, but I'm very curious to find out, if you don't mind sharing, who are you currently working on, assuming it's a biography?
Well, what I'm actually doing now is I've started since finishing Elizabeth Bishop, and through this very disruptive and chaotic period of the pandemic and the political fraught times that we're in, I've begun writing sort of longish essays, and some of them have been, one was in the New Yorker that was about my grandparents in France during World War I. I happen to have their journals and letters, and anyway, I've just been writing these, and then it suddenly dawned on me that maybe a collection would work. So that's what I'm doing, a collection of essays. Some of them are personal history, and some of them are about the art of biography. And so I'm working away on that. And there are some of them consist of kind of outtakes of research that didn't make it into the books that I've written. So I'm happy to have that opportunity, and maybe it's the best thing to be doing right now. I may write another biography sometime, but for now, I'm very happy to work on projects that take maybe 4 or 5 months per essay, and I've got 4 of them, and I hope to write maybe 4 more, and that will be a book.
Excellent. I look forward to it, Megan.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's just been wonderful to talk to you and to learn more from you. A reminder to everybody that there's clearly so much more anyone could talk about with Megan Marshall, but she will be here in Newburyport at 2:00 on Saturday, November 5th at the First Religious Society Unitarian Universalist at 26 Pleasant Street, during which she'll discuss the Peabody Sisters and also her other writings. And this event, as a reminder, is free and open to the public. And if you want to learn more about Megan, she also has her own website, meganmarshallauthor.com. Megan, thank you so much. I so appreciate your writing and you're taking time to visit the morning show today. It was really fun to talk to you.
Thank you, Mary.
All right. That's it for today's show, everybody. Take care and join us next Thursday at 9 for the morning show. Bye, everyone.
Bye. Thank you.